Thank you guys for having us and allowing us to break the first rule of showbiz, which is never follow entrepreneurial children. We're going to do our best. On January 3rd, 2018, I was in the office of the CEO of HBO. He sat me down, and I looked around, and he had assembled Tim Geithner, Ben Bernanke, and Hank Paulson. It was a very quiet room, and he said, "Josh, look at these guys. I see movie stars." It's a very non-traditional approach. They are not movie stars. They're very sedate, wise men. But Richard Plepler wanted to make a documentary about the financial crisis, and I actually thought it was a pretty good idea. First reason being, about 10 years had passed, and as all of us know, perspective changes a lot of things. And things that, in the near past now look very, very different to us. This is a big, complicated issue, and we thought might be worth looking at. Second reason I thought it was a good idea is that I didn't actually have to do it. I just got to executive produce it, and my friend John got to direct it. And so it was a great honor to work with him, but also to let him do most of the work. So John, what did you know about the financial crisis before we gave you this assignment?
It's interesting because I didn't know a lot about it, and yet I participated in it, as many of you probably had, in that I bought my first apartment in New York in 2004-ish. And when I first started looking for an apartment, it was just your typical realtor taking you around. You're looking at apartments. You're thinking, I'll buy New York real estate's always going to go up. Rah, rah, rah. By the end of about a 6-month process of looking for an apartment, there started to be loan officers at the open houses. And they started telling you things like, hey, why do a 30-year mortgage when you can do a 5-1 ARM and you'll pay a lot less? And I think I'm a relatively smart guy. You think I'm a smart guy. But I said, I'll take the 5-1 ARM. Why? Hell, for 5 years, I'll pay a little bit less. I'll get ahead of the game. During that 5-year run, of course, everything started to change. And I remember that whoever was servicing my loan, I think it started at Citibank, went to Chase, ended up with Lakeshore. Banks I'd never heard of suddenly owned my loan, which really started to freak me out. Fortunately, I got out before the ARM went up, but it was a real lesson, and actually something I brought to this in trying to understand the roots of the financial crisis and how everybody got caught up in it. It's part of human nature to want to get that deal, and when you're sold something, even though the old adage is if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is, you still get sucked into it. So this film did have a sort of personal edge for me.
So we're going to show you 3 sections from the film. The first, as a good segue, is actually about the housing crisis. The film has pretty much everybody who was responsible for the crisis and solving the crisis and everything after in it, including George Bush, Barack Obama, Warren Buffett, heads of the big banks. So have a look. We're going to look at a section about the housing crisis right now. Thanks.
When I arrived in July of 2006, I thought there was a very good chance that in the 2.5 years I was in Washington, we would be facing a financial crisis. But the things that I was concerned about turned out not to be the biggest problem.
It was March 13th, which happens to be my birthday. I was at Avra, this Greek restaurant down here with my parents, my family. The CEO of Bear Stearns called me. It was maybe 9 o'clock at night and said, Jamie, I need $29 billion before Asia opens or we're gonna have to declare bankruptcy. And I said, Alan, I can't possibly lend you $29 billion overnight.
Bear Stearns, one of the most admired firms in America, now one of the most in danger.
The firm has been buffeted by constant rumors of a looming liquidity problem.
What happened at Bear Stearns was the first true demonstration of what the crisis looked like, because it was a crisis of confidence. Bear Stearns owned a huge piece of the housing business, and they had taken on some of the worst risk. All of a sudden, all sorts of investors on Wall Street said, I don't think that Bear Stearns is good for the money. And not only do I not think they're good for the money, I got to get my money out of there immediately.
Bear Stearns is the biggest casualty yet of the nation's mortgage mess.
The company has become a poster boy for the real estate bubble.
We knew that there are excesses in housing, and we missed it totally. Homeownership went, very sadly, from shelter to an investment. When had joined Goldman Sachs in 1974. The industry was growing in many ways. You saw an evolution in modern finance. You began to see different forms of securitizations.
Mortgage-backed securities really came into being in the 1980s. They started as a really good idea, which made a lot of sense, which was a way to take mortgages, package them up, and sell off the cash flows. So an investor would buy a portion of all these mortgages, and the mortgages would pay that investor. And the idea was that made investing in mortgages much less risky, because instead of investing in just me, you were investing in 1,000 people.
As we moved to securitization, we had cheaper mortgages. If you could afford 20% down, fine. But if you couldn't, let's say you have 5%, let's say you had 1%, let's say you had 0%. We came up with all these ways to get loans to more people. You know, it was certainly felt exciting at the time that we were going to spread the American dream all over the place.
It's a record year for housing, and it shows no signs of abating.
In the early 2000s, the price of borrowing to finance a house was very low, very attractive.
These exotic loans have exploded in the last 3 years.
Interest-only loans, adjustable rate loans, no down payment options.
People who were earning like $1,000 a month working as a gardener or working as a hairstylist saying they were making $10,000 a month because you could do these things called stated income loans, which came to be known as liar loans, where you could just say, here's what I make, and nobody would check. And so you could get away with murder.
Demand for these million-dollar-plus homes has outpaced supply.
You got speculators buying multiple houses, people are flipping.
Your neighbor who's not as smart as you are, but nevertheless went out and bought a couple of houses and flipped them, is now driving a better car than you are. And you say, yeah, that does make pretty good sense. I wish I'd started earlier.
As the housing market heated up, there were asset management firms around the world that all wanted a way to benefit.
Most things on Wall Street start with a concept that makes a lot of sense. The thing about Wall Street is they take everything to an extreme.
They take thousands of mortgages and staple them together. And they go to investors and they say, what do you want? You want safe? You want risky? We got all these mortgages.
There was an incentive to chop up these loans because along the way, there was a profit, a fee to take for each institution that somehow touched every piece of the loan.
Goldman Sachs, with quarterly profits up 93%.
Everyone was making a lot of money because of the housing market, the liquidity, globalization.
Top executives will earn as much as $20 to $50 million each.
Just the booming 2000s, people were making so much money. I could make 10, 15, 20, 30, 100 to $200 million. And so there was this competition, which was ridiculous.
Chuck Prince was the CEO of Citigroup, and he had an amazing line, which was, while the music's playing, you gotta dance.
Big bonuses are driven simply by profits and competition.
Everybody was looking at the success of Goldman Sachs and of Morgan Stanley and of Lehman Brothers, all of whom were making more and more profits.
The company will distribute a record high $16.5 billion in compensation.
So there was this remarkable pressure on everybody to keep dancing.
So my previous job, I was the editor-in-chief of Business Week during the crisis, and we must have lost hundreds of hours trying to simplify an explanation for how the housing crisis even came to be. And just to talk about filmmaking for a second, how hard was it to get it down to just 3 to 5 minutes, explaining this incredibly complicated thing?
It wasn't easy, but I find that what I have to do is really force myself to get it to its essence, just for myself to understand it. Like I got it to its basic sort of, you beat it down until it's like, it's next to death. And then you say, okay, does it make any sense? And then you kind of resurrect what pieces seem to be sort of key. But it's not easy. It is a wrestling match, as you know. And we had the ability in this film to have all of the original players. You know, I could go to Jamie Dimon and say, tell me about that phone call. How did this start? I mean, that was an amazing moment, you know, the idea that he can still remember where he was at dinner. I mean, those sorts of...
To be fair, I remember every place I am when someone asks me for $20 million. I always know.
That must be on a daily basis for someone like Jamie Dimon.
It happens a lot.
No, but what I also want to do is connect with people emotionally. So you look for those stories that try to elucidate something bigger. Austin Goolsbee is also in this. He is the consummate professional in terms of winnowing down ideas through parables, through stories. So I have to say that my job was made a lot easier by the cast. I mean, they really, as you'll see in clips coming up, we had President Bush, we had President Obama, and when they speak, you're sort of forced to drill down into what was important to them at the moment. That's true too of what we call the three amigos, Geithner and Bernanke and Paulson. They have relived this in their heads so many times. This was their worst nightmare for them. So for them, it was like waking up every night to this nightmare. Like, was the economy going to collapse? Were they going to go into the Great Depression? And I think that also helped me imbue the storytelling with real emotion and also get to the real nut of it.
So you mentioned this a little bit in your own experience. Given how willfully complicated some major financial institutions made the mortgage getting process, when you look back on it, we now have the benefit of 11 years, how much responsibility do you think the mortgage lenders and the liar loan makers bear versus individuals who might have known in their hearts that this was a little bit too good to be true?
I think there's so much about us as Americans that are aspirational. I did a film a few years ago called College Inc., which was about predatory lending in the college space and for for-profit colleges. And since then, we've gotten a lot of them closed that we're preying on people who were told you got to get a college education, and here's some cheap money, and here's a cheap diploma, and will it work or not work? So I find that sort of predatory practice awful. And I think this one was a little bit more sinister because it's the true aspiration. Home ownership in this country has always been the path to the American dream, right? And so to sell that on the cheap and without regulation and the massive deregulation that went on seems to be the greater evil. And I put it on the banks and I put it on a few administrations, I think in a bipartisan way, who went out of the way to deregulate banks and stimulate growth and I think went overboard. But I blame myself too. I was part of it. I wanted to believe that I could probably have a house that I maybe couldn't afford for a little cheaper. I think there's a lot of blame to go around. What's interesting is HBO put this film out on YouTube now for free. So if you wanted to go see it, if you don't have HBO, you can watch it on YouTube. And I noticed in about 2 weeks, about 500,000 people have watched it, and about 6,000 people have left a lot of comments. Most of the comments are still very angry at the government for bailing out banks. And that's difficult even for me. As you'll see in the film, it was a hard decision for those guys, and I feel the pain that they went through in making that decision. Even though you could say, well, Hank Paulson was at Goldman Sachs, made a lot of money for Goldman Sachs. It's still at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and some of us do some bad stuff, but some of us have to clean up the mess. And I found those guys to be that.
So we're going to move on to our next section. One of the things people forget, because it was 10 years ago, is that our economy was imploding during a presidential election. And this added unbelievable complications to the entire process of bailing out homeowners, banks, et cetera. So we're going to tee up our second section, which really launches us right into the middle of the presidential election. So we'll look at that now.
Lehman taking a beating right now, down about 35%. It hasn't traded this low since 1998.
Lehman Brothers, in particular, both was leveraged, but more importantly, had taken on a huge amount of real estate. And that real estate, every day, was being marked down even more.
Another tough day for shares of Lehman Brothers today. CEO Dick Fuld is actively shopping the entire brokerage firm.
Dick Fuld was looking for capital. He contacted us. I had talks with him. I came down on a Friday night, I remember, and looked through a 200 and some page 10K and scribbled a lot of notes on it. I still have the 10K. And by the time I got all through, I knew we weren't going to make a deal.
By that week in September,
we had a dinner at the Federal Reserve for to say goodbye to Hank. Clearly, it'd been a really tough time for him, and I'm sure he was relieved that he no longer would have the responsibility. But we knew that we could still count on him and that we could call him and talk to him.
As stressful as working for 18 months during the crisis, the first year I was out of government was the hardest period by far for me. I sort of sat on the sidelines with my heart in my throat. But I look at it now and I say, wow, policy continuity.
President Obama, we first met in late October, and at the end of our meeting, he said, I might need to ask you to come work with me in Washington. And I was deeply reluctant to do it.
So we all forgot about the election so much that we actually fast-forwarded right through those clips. They're going to tee up the right clip for us. But I do want to talk to you about the politics of this. You got to interview George W. Bush. You got to interview Barack Obama about it. How did you sense they felt 10 years later about the circumstances? And just to remind everybody, the main event of the campaign was John McCain suspending his campaign while he was down about 10 to 12 points in what many people believed was a political stunt to come back to Washington to, quote unquote, solve the financial crisis. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about first what George Bush thought of this, and then what Barack Obama thought of this.
I think George Bush is, like Paulson and Geithner and Bernanke, are desperate to correct the record. And I think he felt like, first of all, he wouldn't stop talking, which I was sort of amazed by. We spent a lot of time together talking about this issue. And I think he saw himself as a guy who had three major crises on his watch, right? He had 9/11, he had Hurricane Katrina, and he had the potential for the Second Great Depression. And I think in his mind, he wanted to have a corrective. And so part of that corrective was letting me know that he felt like he hired the right people. So we talked a lot about that and about his method of management, which was to bring on the best people, take their advice, and kind of help them make the right decisions. And he kept kind of wanting to go over that and over again. President Obama was much more, as is his nature, was just sort of breaking it down and looking at the larger social trends and the kind of impact that the 2008 financial crisis had that he inherited. I mean, there's a really incredible moment in this film that President Obama told me that he knew he was going to be president in September before even the first debate. And he called Hank Paulson and said, look, I don't want to inherit this mess. I don't want to inherit the Second Great Depression. So let me know how I can help. So he was very involved all the way through the bailouts. He was, on the phone almost constantly with Hank Paulson. So it was an interesting moment of, believe it or not, a lot of bipartisanship, which is something I think we could use more of today.
Yeah, there's also a meeting, a very famous meeting, which we get behind the scenes of, which is President Bush invites Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Mitch McConnell, and the two people running for president to the White House after McCain has announced he's coming back to Washington. Can you kind of talk through what happened at that closed-door meeting?
Oh my God, it was unbelievable. I mean, everybody, I think it was Barney Frank was there as well, so he had leadership on both sides. And they were there, Hank had already come up with a plan, right? He had a plan that they were going to buy debt. It wasn't really clear how they were going to buy this debt, but that was the Republican plan. That's what President Bush wanted to do. McCain announces, I want to suspend, I want to do. So he shows up, and everybody thinks, well, he must have a plan. What could his plan possibly be? And Hank and President Bush had worked so hard to kind of get this coalition together. They were worried he was going to blow it up. So they go all around the room, and they're discussing, they're doing their niceties for the press, and then the door closes, and they say, okay, they give Obama he explains that he's been working with Paulson, and Paulson's got a plan, I'm with his plan, and then they turn to John McCain and ask him what his plan is, and he says nothing. He says absolutely nothing. Everybody in that room individually told me he had no plan. It was just a big political stunt. And then President Bush, President Obama, everybody told me the same story. It turned into one of the most incredible shouting matches they've ever experienced. And President Bush called it a food fight. Barney Frank was yelling at Mitch McConnell. Everybody was at each other's throats, and then it just broke up. And as Josh Bolton, the chief of staff, told us, it was the most depressing meeting he'd ever experienced in the White House. I mean, just playing politics with this whole thing.
So one of the things that, in the sort of behind the scenes stuff about the film, we got very few notes from HBO. but one of the notes we got was, this movie is too mean to John McCain. Now, we shot our interviews with all of these political actors. McCain had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was not dead yet. We did not anticipate this in any way, but they were ferocious. They were, to a person on the Republican side and the Democratic side, they were scathing in their critique of McCain. You brought up the kind of emotion that all this still brings out in people. Were you surprised by that?
I was. I mean, you think these are sort of, government bureaucrats who are just, making policy. You always wonder if people feel the weight of the office, when they're in, it doesn't matter if they're in a low-level cabinet position to the Supreme Court to whatever. I always want to believe they feel the weight of their decision-making right on all of us. And, but I understood it kind of in the abstract. And talking to these guys, you realize they did feel the weight. I mean, Hank worked himself to, there's moments when he's having panic attacks and vomiting in Nancy Pelosi's office when they're trying to negotiate the TARP funding. There's Rahm Emanuel's in the film, who had some very pointed words for the Republican side. I mean, yeah, you feel the real raw emotion. And that was true even with the president, who is traditionally quite, known to be very cool. He lost his cool a lot in this process because it was something he inherited, I mean, he really had to solve this problem. And when you think about it, it wasn't until he wanted to bail out the homeowners on this end that was the sort of initial spark for the Tea Party. That's something I had forgotten about. When Rick Santelli went on to the floor of the Chicago Stock Exchange and called out President Obama, name-checked President Obama, that was really the opening expression of the Tea Party movement, when we wanted to bail out the homeowner. So it's so complicated, and the politics got so wrapped up into it, and it's something many of us are still dealing with today.
So that's a good segue into our last clip, which starts in early 2009. I think we had it up before. But this is really about the aftermath, the immediate aftermath, and still the long-term political aftermath, which we're going to get to in a second. So why don't we take a look at that now, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it after.
A dinner at the Federal Reserve to say goodbye to Hank. Clearly been a really tough time for him, and I'm sure he was relieved that he no longer would have the responsibility. But we knew that we could still count on him and that we could call him and talk to him.
As stressful as working for 18 months during the crisis, the first year I was out of government was the hardest period by far for me. I sort of sat on the sidelines with my heart in my throat. But I look at it now and I say, wow, policy continuity.
President Obama, we first met in late October, and at the end of our meeting, he said, I might need to ask you to come work with me in Washington. And I was deeply reluctant to do it.
He encouraged me not to do it. He said, Mr. President, you don't want to bring me on. I've been on the front lines on this thing. Maybe what you need is a clean break. But I trusted Tim as someone who was a technician, who was non-ideological. He was my best bet.
Good morning.
Ultimately, if the president asks you to serve your country and you believe in him or her, it's a hard thing not to do.
Today, Vice President-elect Biden and I are pleased to announce the nomination of Timothy Geithner as Secretary of Treasury.
We did a whole range of things to keep the mortgage markets open, lower interest rates, help people refinance, help people stay in their home.
President Barack Obama is rolling out the next step in his multi-pronged plan to revive the U.S. economy, a $75 billion program to help struggling homeowners.
But if you remember the public debate, there was a huge opposition to bailing out the homeowner, too.
This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. President Obama, are you listening?
It's a famous rant by Rick Santelli, which a lot of people view as the beginning expression of what became the Tea Party.
You work for us. You work for us. Let's stand together. Let's stand with honor. Let's restore America.
The Tea Party begins with the announcement of the housing program. And they say, this is all for deadbeats and rewarding people who don't deserve it. We should form a Tea Party.
I was not surprised by the public backlash because a year after we've spent $1 trillion+, people are still going to feel worse. And all they see is that there's a whole bunch of money going to the folks who perpetrated some of these terrible things.
Financial crises are often followed by populist reaction, but I think it's important to understand, though, that there's some very long-term trends in the United States, including the stagnation of wages, the reduction in upward mobility for people, lack of opportunity. There's a whole number of things which have contributed to the present moment. Financial crisis didn't help that, but it obviously exacerbated some underlying tensions in the United States.
Two of AIG's former CEOs were grilled about a retreat where only a week after being bailed out by taxpayers, its executives spent $440,000 on oceanfront rooms, rounds of golf, and trips to the resort spa and salon.
They were getting their manicures, their facials, their pedicures, and their massages, while the American people were footing the bill.
One of the worst days I had came when we learned that AIG was contractually obligated to pay bonuses to some of the people in the financial products division. And I knew that was a catastrophe, and there was going to be a huge problem politically.
American people had to bail out AIG, but most Americans still lost 40 to 50% of their retirement plans.
If we had not made that action, they would have lost 70%.
I think it was clear it was going to be fraud. At the core of the challenge was, again, is this basic thing about fairness and morality. How do you figure out a way to protect the public interest without creating a whole bunch of private beneficiaries?
Did the people who took out insurance with AIG to insure their retirement plans get reimbursed 100% so they suffered very little loss? Yes or no? Not one of you three can give me a yes on that answer, or no.
Because it's a poorly posed question.
The fact that the American public hates what we did is not surprising, because in many ways it's un-American.
Several hundred people packed into Bowling Green Park in Lower Manhattan for what they're calling an Occupy Wall Street demonstration.
People are definitely getting screwed over right now and getting hurt by a lot of the powers that be, and we want to see a change in that.
People struggling to pay their mortgages, incomes that haven't gone up, all this strain, and people at the very top walking off, acting like their shit doesn't stink.
Since 2000, you've taken home more than $480 million. Are these figures basically accurate?
I would assume they are.
And that whole attitude is that people think that there are two rule books, one for the elite and one for everybody else. And that started off a populist revolt.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of the United States, Mr. Donald J. Trump.
The fuse was lit in 2008, and Donald Trump was the explosion. He's the result of the financial crisis.
There's a lot of Washington lobbyists, bureaucrats, politicians who don't want to see things change. That's because everybody is making a fortune, and people outside of that area are paying for the money they're making. We're not going to have it.
The crisis awakens people to that sense that the game is rigged. This economy is not working for me.
This is a sick system from the inside. We have a lot of sickness in some of our institutions.
And in that kind of environment, if you've got irresponsible politicians who want to take advantage of that and start scapegoating people who don't look like you or start trafficking in conspiracy theories, yeah, there's going to be more of an audience for that. And it tests our democracy in ways that are troubling.
We're going to take care of this country for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and we're not going to let people come into our country who are going to destroy our country. When do you hear that?
Crises breed populism. And yes, economics go along with politics. And If one is broken, the other gets broken. And it's going to take very strong leadership to bring this country together because we're very polarized.
That's a nice optimistic note to return to you guys on. So, John, President Obama gave us, by his standards, a lot of time. Do you remember the last question you asked him?
Yes, the one that he said, okay, I think we're done.
That's the one. So, the president was very gracious with his time. John then, realizing we're on the clock, says, Mr. President, if we were greeted by the same circumstances and the same crisis in the current political environment with the current political leadership, how do you think we'd do? And he uncrossed his legs, unclipped his mic, and said, all right, guys, thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put this to you then.
Great.
And you can't take off the mic and you cannot walk out. How do you think we'd do?
Oh, man. I don't know. You know, look, I have been amazed. Not in this, I don't mean this part, I mean this as just an observer of the current state of political play, that with all the chaos making that's going on in the Oval Office right now, that the sort of fine tissue of our democracy and our economy is held up. And it's proven to me that our institutions are strong. And that's sort of gives me a little bit of hope that you can jump up and down on them like a crazy person and they still somehow hold up. Now, he hasn't had a massive crisis yet. You know, he's doing a lot of saber rattling all over the world. But this economy has remained for some, you know, pretty stable. So I don't know. I mean, God forbid. I honestly, I worry about the first big crisis like that, economically, for sure.
Not to put it entirely on Trump, one of the things that you see in this film is that, and again, to remind you of events, the bailouts went to Congress and they failed.
Right.
We took a vote on them. Nancy Pelosi in our film says directly, I always have my votes. I count my votes. Well, the Republicans didn't have their votes. And so the first time the bailout failed, the market tumbled tremendously. The second time, everybody sort of got together and in a bipartisan way decided, well, we got our focus group. They hated the fact that we didn't do this bailout vote, and now we're going to do it. So it wasn't just Trump. There was leadership of the more moderate Republican side that gritted its teeth and did it. Do you sense, aside from what's going on in the White House, that there's that appetite in Washington writ large to solve these problems?
I don't sense it. I mean, in looking at the film, you see people like John Boehner in support of this, you know, reaching across the aisle. I remember thinking John Boehner was so partisan at the time. So everything has changed, you know, the whole compass, everything feels like it's been thrown up in the air in terms of what I think is normal in Washington and what I've seen as a journalist in Washington. It feels like the playing field is really, really different. And I don't know that anybody could reach across the aisle. Every day I feel like Mitch McConnell is just, you know, burying himself deeper into partisanship. So I don't know. I mean, it just seems like, you know, I remember, you know, in making the film, you remember these moments. And I remember that bill failing in the House, you know, when I remember living through that and thinking, what is, you know, being on pins and needles and thinking, we got to solve this. Like, I own a home now. I'm an adult. Like, these things have consequences. And so I don't, look, I want to have hope. I want to believe that they would come together. But if we're just, you know, objective about it, it's worrisome. It's very worrisome. And that's something I think, too, that the principals in this film wanted to get across. You know, I think that was important to President Obama and President Bush and others, that, look, we reached across the aisle. There was a lot of bickering. It was hard. Many bitter pills were swallowed. But we did it. We passed this bill that everybody hates. You know, it was like eating castor oil, as they say. Like, everybody hated the TARP. It was $700 billion bailout, which actually grew into the trillions over the course of even the last decade, of bailing out I don't know how many banks while other people, suffered, while people lost their jobs, people have not recovered. It was a bitter, bitter pill, but I think they thought they were staving off something far worse, which was the Great Depression. As you'll see in the film, Bernanke was a student of the Great Depression and saw early on that not saving the banks is what kind of caused some of the major problems in the Great Depression. So for him, that was the first step. They would argue that, look, the government got paid back. They made $50 billion on all of the deals, and they all got paid back by the major banks. But is that really a measure of success? When you look at how it has affected our country, it's largely divided our country in many ways along economic lines. The thing that Rahm Emanuel says about the two different playbooks, that does feel real in this electorate.
So about our principles, we did work very closely with Hank Paulson, Tim Geithner, Ben Bernanke. And when I screened the film for Bernanke privately in our Washington bureau, it was very quiet, finished. He sort of nodded his head, and I was waiting for a verdict. And he said, I guess I just hadn't realized what tragic figures we are, which I thought was very sad.
Mm-hmm.
And you spent a ton of time with these guys. You really pulled out as much sort of introspection as you could get from them. What are your sort of primary observations about what it was like for those people to live through something of this magnitude, and really even the people who approve of their performance hate what happened? What's it like to be in that seat?
Well, it's funny because Ben Bernanke told me a story that it used to be every time he was seen in the airport, someone would give him hell. They'd say, why'd you give all the money away? You didn't know it. And he said over the course of time, and maybe that's just the sort of the reality of history, right? We always need critical distance to judge people. President Bush is certainly one who believes he'll be judged more positively in the passage of time. But he said that 2 to 1 now is a little bit better, where he gets a little bit more of a pat on the back and is recognized for having been put into battle in a really bad time. But it took a huge toll on them. Hank told me that he, and I'm sure he's only given me half of it, but was in a deep, deep, deep depression afterwards. And I'm not sure he's fully recovered. He's a sort of manic character now about wanting to get the story out there. All 3 of them have written books that tell their version of events. All of them have clever names like On the Brink or something, some sort of
stress
play on
test.
words. Stress test, On the Brink. And yeah, I think it was absolutely devastating to them. And even some of the congressmen, like Barney Frank, I don't think, when people look back and think about what was going on with Fannie and Freddie, the big, federal home loan, that's still a little bit of a powder keg. I mean, Fannie and Freddie still back something like $5 trillion worth of home loans in this country. It's now it's a nationalized company, but there's still a private part of that company that is quite worrisome. So I still think they see some trouble spots and worry, and I think that's part of what they're trying to get out there is trying to correct the record and trying to sort of get at what you were saying. It was like, what if it happened today? Are we ready? And I think they actually are putting out a book soon. They want to put out a roadmap about how to handle a panic, because this was essentially a panic. It was a crisis of confidence. People were running, and they want to lay out a roadmap about the things they think they did right and some of the things they did wrong. So in a weird way, it's affected in that it continues to play. It's the biggest thing they've ever done in their lives, for sure. No question.
All right, well, that's our time. I want to thank the Hope Global Forum for having us. Thank you guys
Thank you guys very much.
Your attention. Hope you have a great rest of the night. Thanks.
Thank you.